This is an age of disruption, of profound revolutionary change.
What we're really asking ministers is to empower the ambassadors.
The only thing that you really push forth is the truth.
You don't see many women represented when it comes to the decisions as to how to handle the pandemic.
Well, good afternoon, and thank you very much for joining us. This is Politico Live, the live extension of our unparalleled journalism, which has clearly all brought you out today on a warm Brussels Monday. Delighted to welcome you all here, and it's going to be a really interesting session, I think, with lots of speakers. I'm coming to you, for those online, from ACE Events in Brussels. And I'd like to welcome again those of you joining us in person, as well as everyone listening online through our live stream. Now, there's been a tremendous amount of interest in this event, and I think that's because hydrogen is one of the most interesting and controversial topics in EU policymaking right now. Policymakers, experts, green activists are unambiguous that if we're going to tackle climate change, we need clean new fuels. But that doesn't mean there aren't still contradictions when it comes to hydrogen. On one hand, the EU is making billions, tens of billions, available in funding to kickstart the industry. But on the other, there's fears that's still not enough. On one side, we've seen this explosion in the amount of manufacturing going into hydrogen, going into electrolyzers, and going into clean fuels. But again, on the other, many people fear the pieces of the puzzle simply aren't falling into place just yet. Europe, and indeed, many of the people we'll be speaking to today have been spending the last few years getting the regulatory and policy framework right. But there's a risk that at the last moment, countries like the US and China will sweep in and corner the industry, reaping the benefits from the high-tech jobs it's due to create. Well, we're going to be discussing this and more with our panelists this afternoon. But first, some housekeeping. I'd like to thank our partner, CEPSA, for making this event possible, as well as our fantastic Politico Live team who've made it all come together. And as I said, we want to make things as interactive as possible. You can participate by tweeting or Xing or whatever it's called now about the debate and asking questions through slide.do online using the hashtag EU Hydrogen Race. I'd only ask that if you do, you give your name and organization that you're representing, just so it's fully transparent for us, for the viewers, for the panelists. But why wait? You can share your thoughts already by answering the poll presented by CEPSA. 1 year after the IRA is the question. 1 year after the US Inflation Reduction Act, how well positioned is the EU to lead a global hydrogen economy? Before we get started, I'd like to invite opening remarks from our partner, Martin Retzeler, CEO of CEPSA.
Thank you very much. And good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. So is Europe losing the hydrogen race? It shouldn't be. After all, Jules Verne gave Europe a head start about 150 years ago. He wrote the novel The Mysterious Island, in which he considered what humans would use when there was no more coal. One of his characters, an engineer, declared it would be water. Water broken down into its elemental parts. And here we are 150 years after Jules Verne, trying to make his vision a reality. And it is a race, don't get me wrong. It's not so much a race against the US or China, although their efforts will spur us on and their competition will inspire us. It's a race against climate change. There's more than 1,000 of you here today, in the room and online, and it tells me that you already believe that green hydrogen represents an opportunity in this race, an opportunity for Europe. It could power European reindustrialization with domestic renewable energy. Energy that's also affordable. Energy whose cost is tied to the falling cost of renewables and not the unstable geopolitics of oil and gas, where the gas price in Spain depends on strikes in Australia. So it is a huge opportunity. It's also a fantastic opportunity for Spain. Now, why is that? Spain gets more sun than any other EU state. It has optimal conditions for onshore wind power and an ultra-modern grid to produce the cheapest green hydrogen in Europe. It also has ports that can export this green hydrogen in the form of methanol or ammonia, and advanced plans to connect to the markets through pipelines. All of that makes green hydrogen a massive opportunity for a company like Cepsa. And Cepsa is moving fast to take that opportunity. Along with our partners, we are building the Green Hydrogen Valley in Andalusia. It will be Europe's largest green hydrogen hub with 2 gigawatts of capacity. Some of that will feed the biggest second-generation biofuels plant in Southern Europe that we're building at the moment. And we're helping to decarbonize aviation industry. Some of the green hydrogen will be used by industry partners in the region. Some of it will feed our maritime customers. And some of it will travel to Rotterdam as ammonia to supply customers in Northern and Central Europe with ammonia or in its cracked form back to hydrogen. In short, we're building world-scale green hydrogen capacity in Andalusia in the south of Spain. It will support EU targets on industrial decarbonization and energy independence. So Cepsa is moving fast. The EU too has been very active. Critically, Europe is generating demand for green hydrogen at the same time as encouraging supply. The EU has done great work with the Green Deal Industrial Plan, including the proposed Net Zero Industry Act and the Critical Raw Materials Act. The European Hydrogen Bank is also a promising move. Very encouragingly, the first pilot auction will take place soon with €800 million to go. The EU's clear and ambitious targets are also a crucial signal to the market and to business to give confidence to invest. For example, Repower EU's goal of 10 million tons of domestically produced green hydrogen by 2030 and another 10 million tons imported. And by pushing forward the Fit for 55 packages, the EU is supporting the market in the form of mandates, both for industrial decarbonization and for transport sectors, such as maritime and aviation. In addition, of course, the EU carbon market provides a solid foundation for the kind of demand generation that is unique to Europe and that is not taking place elsewhere, for example, in the US. But having said that, there is really no time to rest. As fast as we are moving now, Europe must accelerate. Just as China and the US must accelerate, or climate change will win the race and beat us. In the EU, one way to move faster would be to classify all products eligible under the Renewable Energy Directive and their value chains as strategic net zero technologies, including synthetic renewable fuels as well as advanced biofuels. That would allow accelerated permitting and funding. Another way would be for the EU to streamline and simplify its funding sources. The speed at which they move are often incompatible with the pace of investment decisions, and their predictability is often poor. It should also provide dedicated financing for essential energy infrastructure, like the H2Med hydrogen pipeline project. So, ladies and gentlemen, is Europe losing the hydrogen race? Is the world losing the hydrogen race? And what can we all do to help Jules Verne be right after all? We could not be in better hands to find out. I cede the podium to the panel.
Well, thanks very much, Martin. It's hard to imagine a more veritable who's who of hydrogen movers and shakers than the people we've got here today. For those of you joining us online, I just wanted to mention, I'm Gabriel Gavin. I'm a reporter with Politico covering energy, oil, gas, and the politics of power. And with me today is, as I say, I mean, we've been lucky to be able to get absolutely everyone who has had a role in the development of the hydrogen bank. People who've played roles lobbying for the technology, for the policy infrastructure around it. And I think we're just going to get up the names on screen so you'll be able to see as well. So, we have first, I'd like to invite up Ruud Kempener, a member of Energy Commissioner Kadri Simpson's cabinet at the EU Commission. Ruud, thank you very much for joining us. We've got Swedish Green MEP Jakob Dalunde, representing the European Parliament. We've got someone who I think is probably familiar to many of you here today, the indefatigable, if I can say the word, face of hydrogen lobbying, Yorgo Chatzimarkakis. And we've got Marta Lovasolo, Senior Policy Advisor for Renewable Energy Systems at Bellona Europe. Thanks very much. Well, Ruud, let's start us off. I mean, how much is it fair to say you've been focusing on hydrogen and the Commission has been focusing on hydrogen over the last couple of years? How much work has gone into get us where we are today?
In terms of hours, Monday to Friday, weekends, early mornings, late nights, we got complaints that we push out papers at 12 o'clock at night. It's not because we want to hide them, it's because people are working until 12 o'clock to get this done. But this is not a question for me alone, I think, because if you think also towards this question about kind of the title of today, I think one of the key aspects of all of this is that you need to create a team, essentially, to do anything, to make anything happen. And this is, I think, what has happened here within the EU in the last 3 years. Hydrogen is a tremendous important player to meet this kind of challenge of climate change. It really, really is. And we have a couple of other players alongside that as well. The renewables, the energy efficiency, all of those matter as well. But what I think that we've been doing here in the last 3 years is to really create this team around this hydrogen player. This striker, if you may want to call it, with, I often hear the word industry, but it's multiple industries which have been working on this. It's the industry that produces the green electrons. It's the industry which makes the pipes. It's the industry which makes the storage. It's the industry which makes the electrolyzers. It's the industry which ultimately has to make those investment decisions to use that hydrogen in their end-use sectors. But it's the same also from all of the other kind of players, stakeholders, as you may want to call it. Because in order to make this hydrogen the enabler that it can be for our energy transition, we also need kind of the buy-in of everyone and anyone who's going to handle eventually that hydrogen, and ultimately is going to buy those green products.
Yeah. And just to address the elephant in the room early on, I mean, how many of those late nights have been done because you're laying awake worrying about the US Inflation Reduction Act, about cheap manufacturing coming from China?
I think one of the striking points is that the US published its hydrogen strategy last October. This is almost 3 years kind of from where we started actually thinking with all of us on what the role of hydrogen would be for Europe. So I think that it is very important to see the US and China, etc., moving also in this sphere, but also everyone else. Because one of the key elements that we also want to achieve, of course, is that whatever we are achieving here in Europe can also enable the energy transition, for example, in Africa and Latin America and everything. So I don't see this competition as one of the key elements right now at the moment. What I think is much more important is that after this year, after we have all of these pieces of legislation in place, that we are confident, not only us sitting here on the table, but also those people who ultimately have to invest in it, that they are confident that this energy transition is going to work. And if we can achieve that, then I'm not too worried about what is happening in the rest of the world.
Jakob, how fair is any of that? I mean, from your perspective as a parliamentarian, how much has the Commission done and how much more does the Commission need to do?
Well, the tricky thing is that we don't want politicians to be the pickers of who will win and who will lose in terms of which industry, in terms of which technology. And it's yet a bit unclear in which sectors hydrogen makes the most sense. There's one example where it's fantastic. In north of Sweden, we're currently producing steel with zero emissions. Hydrogen makes perfect sense since it can fill a role that no other zero emission technology can do it. While at the same time, if you look at land transport, maybe we overestimated, at least in the short term, which role that hydrogen can play. I saw some number the other day that we have spent, I think, 82,000 euros per individual charging station for hydrogen for cars and trucks, which is extremely expensive. But still, in order to adopt a new technology, you need politicians to act, to create the infrastructure, to provide R&D, to create investment certainty. So, I mean, it's a tricky business. It is.
Certainly is. And I'm sure someone who's familiar with just how tricky getting it right is obviously Jorgo. A couple of months ago, we did a story. I interviewed Jorgo, and he told me that bureaucracy, typical European bureaucracy, was threatening to kill the hydrogen industry. And you warned that Joe Biden, with his Inflation Reduction Act, had come in like a kind of dung beetle to steal all the dung that the Europeans had stocked up. And really there was a risk that Europe was going to lose all the work it had done to get ahead in this kind of quote-unquote hydrogen race that some of us clearly think exists, some maybe think it's actually more a race against climate change. Do you think it's fair, a few months down the line, after we've seen more information about the upcoming hydrogen bank tender, first tender in November, is it fair to say that Europe is still on track to lose the hydrogen race, or are you more optimistic now than you were?
Well, first of all, I have to thank both Commission and Parliament for basically taking a choice into hydrogen. That's what you both did. And I think it's the next generations that need to be grateful to you guys because, I mean, the hydrogen strategy was made within 3 months. After COVID broke out, there was a high-level conference in May 2020, and 3 months later, the hydrogen strategy was done. So, bravo, that was fast. But to be precise on the dung beetle, I mean, the dung beetle is an animal where the male part wants to attract the female part by making big dung balls, right? It's a hard work. And that's what we did. That's what, Ruth, you did with night calls and night. Big work. And there are smart dung beetles that don't do these dung balls. They just wait. And when the others are sweating, they come and pick the best girls. That's Joe Biden. That's what I said. Joe Biden is basically, he let us Europeans do the hard work, the robust legislation, and then it's easier for him to do tax credits. Tax credits are very, very interesting for industry because they are incentives. It's easy to do. You don't need to have a bureaucracy. You don't need to have politicians vote for giving taxpayers money to somebody. No, you just don't let him pay taxes. We can't do that as Europeans because tax is member state job. It's not job of these guys here. So we have better conditions to start with. However, we made it. We have no Swiss knife like the Americans have. One IRA, one Inflation Reduction Act that shows everybody, okay, that's the Swiss knife with some applications, I can go for it. We have this toolbox with this very, very big toolbox, chaotic, you don't know how to find.
EU subsidies are more common.
EU subsidies, that's what the Hydrogen Bank will fix. The Hydrogen Bank has less money, but gives some order to the toolbox, makes it easier for SMEs, for small and medium companies, but also for CEPSA to understand, this is where I need to go, and this is the order that we need. So I'm more confident, to answer your question. I think, and I'm very optimistic, the first pilot, Martin mentioned it, will be launched 20th of November at the Hydrogen Week organized by the European Commission and Hydrogen Europe. So I hope Maros Šefčovič will ring the bell and open this tender. It's a pilot tender. It's 800 million. So it's money, but it's not very much compared to what China, Japan, US is doing. but it's the start. No? Let's pilot it. We were first ones to start with robust systems. We will also be the first ones to give confidence to the markets that we are an attractive direction for hydrogen, being importers or being producers of the technology.
And Marta, I'll spare you a question on dung and dung beetles, but regardless of who's balling up the dung, do you think it's moving in the right direction? As someone who, you focus on the environment, you focus on this kind of all-encompassing mission to protect the planet. Do you think that we're moving in the right direction and that hydrogen is helping propel us there?
So I think hydrogen must be part of the future energy system for us to beat climate change. I think this is clear to everybody. But I also think that hydrogen has the risk to actually put us in the wrong spot. If we don't do hydrogen carefully, we end up actually creating risks for the environment. We end up directing our very limited resources towards inefficient ways to use them. And they're limited. We have a lot of renewables, but they're not enough. They're not enough yet. So we need to be very careful on how we use that. And so I think, actually, the European, maybe very complex way to having a lot of tools to address hydrogen, it's very good. Because we started from the Renewable Energy Directive and thinking, okay, where do we need hydrogen? We need hydrogen to decarbonize industry. We need hydrogen to decarbonize, heavy-duty, long-distance aviation, shipping, transport. So we start from there. We have targets. We create off-takers. And then we regulate how do we produce this hydrogen in a way that actually benefits the environment. And so here it comes the Delegated Act. Here it comes the gas market package, hopefully soon enough. And then from there, we build an economy. Well, when we look at what the US is doing, sure, they have a Swiss knife. But what's the Swiss knife? It's that tool that you have when you have nothing and you don't know how to solve problems, and it kind of half works for everything, but doesn't really work. That's what a Swiss knife is. And I think that's what the IRA is putting a lot of money on the table, is enabling everybody to produce hydrogen, and then there's nobody to buy it.
Yeah.
Because there is no target, there is no subsidy, there is no direction of where this hydrogen should go. So I actually preach the European approach a lot, because it is a climate approach, and it's not a let's create a new business for the sake of making money, whatever the climate.
And Jakob, is that fair? I mean, as part of your appraisal of the Commission's hydrogen plans, have you been concerned that we might end up running in the wrong direction in this race and actually end up incentivizing hydrogen to do the wrong things, or putting in place aspirations that don't match the kind of mission to fight climate change?
Yes, in the sense that you have some tools that are supposed to be there to provide demand for hydrogen and some for supply. And I'm not certain that all the demand that is planned to be there can be supplied by actually green hydrogen. I'm not yet convinced that that is the case. So by only focusing on, or focusing too much on creating more demand, you might, in practice, create an industry that produces hydrogen that is not green. And then we put ourselves in a worse spot, since hydrogen is, as of yet, quite inefficient in that you lose so much in the transmission. So it should only really be applied in the methods where hydrogen is clearly the best choice.
I want to come to Jorgo in just a moment before he tackles you. But first, I just wanted to ask Ruud, I mean, part of this story is money, right? It's about directing this investment. And the EU evidently has less money to throw at attracting jobs, attracting innovative companies than the US is prepared to spend. Is that a bane of your life? Are you worried that we're not spending as much money as our competitors when it comes to drawing in manufacturing? Or do you think that actually they come for other reasons, like regulatory and policy frameworks?
Here, I think a couple of numbers are very, very telling. So if you look at these Repower EU ambitions that we put forward, if you put just very simple calculations, it's about €1 trillion of investments needed to meet that. 500 here, 500 overseas. It's clear that 90% of that needs to come from the private sector. It's as simple as possible. It's as simple as that. But, of course, what you need to do with public sector financing is, for that 10% that we want to do it quick, and make sure that that helps and enables the scale up for the rest. Because that's where we need to use the public financing to really make it as a catalyzer. And there I maybe want to link to another kind of point which I heard over here about this Swiss knife. I'll leave the dung beetle.
We're getting lost in analogies.
To other ones. Is that what is interesting when we all started developing the hydrogen strategy, a long time ago, energy policy was simple. You spoke to other energy departments, energy ministers. Energy transition policy is not simple. It's complex. You need to speak to the transport sector. You need to speak to the industry sector. You need to speak to the infrastructure sector. You need to speak to the end consumer sector. And that was already very clear also when we started to develop this hydrogen strategy, that we needed to bring in all of these policy aspects and create not just a hydrogen policy, but make sure that whatever we did in hydrogen policy was reflected in the transport policies that we're developing, was reflected in the EU ETS that we had to change, reflected in the energy taxation directive that we still want to have. We wanted it to reflect it into the infrastructure policies. So all of these ties, bringing that together and make that coherent, I think is, in terms of scale, important to have. Then have those initial public sector financing accelerating that kind of rapid scale up. And then I think the rest of ultimately the investments will need to come from the private sector. That's what we're here for, to enable that to happen.
Yeah, yeah. And I mean, Jorgo, we've just heard that the kind of businesses that you represent are being relied on to produce the bulk of both the hydrogen we're generating and the infrastructure needed to generate it. Is there such a thing as bad hydrogen investment? Can we waste money investing in the wrong kinds of hydrogen infrastructure, the wrong kinds of hydrogen businesses? And are we spending enough on the right ones?
Well, the European Commission has in published a new study on modeling for 2050. Comes up with an aggressive electricity scenario, aggressive hydrogen scenario. The interesting thing is there's no big difference between both. So even the aggressive electricity scenario needs a lot of hydrogen to balance out basically, well, the overproduction sometimes that you have if you don't have enough grid. And this is why it's not a bad investment. So to answer that question, it's a very good investment. The Americans, by the way, understood. The Americans have seen that from a net importer of energy, fighting wars, many wars, to get oil, to get access to oil and to ship it to the US, they have become a net exporter. And they based it on shale gas. You might like it, you might not. But today they are a very, very aggressive exporter, and that was an appetizer for hydrogen. They will do the same success story with hydrogen. So whatever they do, they attract, and I can feel it. There are companies here in the room, European companies, that are attracted big time by IRA, big time. So what if we want to make what your study says, the study was done by Artelis, France, and Fraunhofer, Germany, to make us energy autonomous in Europe. So the study basically says we don't need even to import. We have Spain, Martin, you said it. We have Spain, we have France, which will both, and Norway, will be the biggest hydrogen producers for Europe. We don't need to import. But in order to get there, we need the technology. At the moment, this technology is attracted by Washington. It might go there. And to buy this technology back, we see what this costs when we look at battery. 91% of dependency on China. Solar, 90% of dependency. That's crazy. Let's not do it again. And this is why I think with this argument, Jakob, that you used, let's look at the efficiency. We can use it. But then we need to be fair and honest. What is efficiency? Look at the system efficiency. I just come back from Cyprus. I was not aware, to be honest, that in Cyprus they ramped up this year, within the last year, big time photovoltaic. They have a curtailment of 22%. 22% of the energy that they produce, they cannot use it. Germany, for 2022, has had costs and curtailment of 4.25 billion. Ruud, if I would have these 4.25 billion for the hydrogen bank, I would say, cheerio, that's it. And they just waste it. They just throw it away. So efficiency is a big word. And hydrogen could have helped to save this energy and to store it. The Cypriots are now starting this strategy. The Germans have already started. So you see, we need to compare apples with apples. And then we will be big as Europeans.
And part of this hydrogen journey is about a European success story, right? It's about being able to transition our energy reliance on autocratic regimes across the world and be able to bring production and jobs back to the European continent. But I have a question from Gerhard Schröder, not the German Chancellor, difference, but I had to check, who says, well, the EU appears to be resigned to actually import hydrogen still. We've obviously got this target to produce 10 million tons and import the same volume. Whether we want it or not, is there a risk of import dependency? And what kind of countries are we going to be depending on for imports? And how certain are we that we're going to be able to have this energy independence? That's the whole point of hydrogen in the first place.
Yeah, and it's a very interesting question, of course. Now, I think there are two elements to it. One is, and I would actually even challenge everyone here in the room who doesn't think that there's going to be some kind of hydrogen trade, like globally. The question is, we as the major kind of demand center in the world, are we going to be part of this global hydrogen trade or not? And I think that's really kind of a very simple and easy question. We should be part of it. We've created it. We are the energy transition champions in the world, so we should play our role and actually take our responsibility there. Now, the second point is that, yes, hydrogen, of course, being produced from renewables, allows us to go to essentially any country, because anywhere you have renewables, which is different than oil or gas fields, which are located to certain member states. So yes, you have the possibility to shift to other energy suppliers on the one hand side, but I don't think that should be the only reason. I really see new energy partnerships and third countries interested in developing these new partnerships with the EU, simply based on the ability for them to tap into their renewable resources and then bring that to the global market, bring that to European players, actually create these value chains across kind of countries. Not only hydrogen, but if you think about the MOUs that we have with Namibia, they actually go beyond that. They're even looking at critical raw materials as one of those partnership value chains. So I think it's not only about like just shifting away from autocratic regimes, it's an ability to really bring the rest of the world in this global energy transition that I do believe Europe is leading.
And Marta, where do you fall on that as an idea? This market-based global hydrogen trade. Are we anywhere near having the kind of infrastructure to make that a reality? And would it lead us in the right direction even if we did?
So I think that there is a success story that we can hope for, and that's the story of Europe starting with hydrogen and bringing with us the rest of the world by setting really good standards and producing truly green hydrogen that also kickstart renewable markets elsewhere in the world. There is also a different story, though. A lot of the countries that are planning to export hydrogen to us, developed and developing. Like we can think about Australia, for instance. It is definitely not a country of the global south, but is a country whose electricity grid heavily relies on coal, and yet is thinking about massively exporting renewable-based hydrogen to Europe. What's the risk of importing so much renewables in the end to Europe? The risk is slowing down the energy transition elsewhere because molecules in Europe are worth more money than electrons in the country that might need those green electrons to simply give electricity access to people, if we think about global south countries, or countries that might need those renewable electrons to electrify, like make their grid green.
So the EU ends up cannibalizing those countries.
There is that risk. I think the Delegated Act sets good standards on additionality. There is a long transitional period that scares us, but we hope the hydrogen economy will ramp up slowly at this point so that the transitional period will run out and we'll be actually able to deploy renewables to supply this hydrogen. But then there are other risks as well. Hydrogen requires a lot of water to be produced. 10 kilos of water per kilo of hydrogen, the minimum, but if that water is not perfectly clean, you can ramp up that to 60 kilos of water per kilo of hydrogen. And that is dangerous in water-scarce areas, which tend to be also those areas that are renewable rich. So that is also something that I think we must be very careful about. And again, hydrogen can be a great resource, can propel us into decarbonization across the world, but also can become the new resource to have resource curses on. So I think the way we develop these inputs will determine whether we are propelling energy transition around the world, or we're just, getting those green electrons in molecule forms to Europe while the rest of the world stays behind.
And one of the great advantages that hydrogen has in this race against climate change is that it can use existing infrastructure, existing platforms, can be driven by industry in a way that doesn't require a huge overhaul of the energy system. So it's a quickly adaptable solution. But when we talk about, for example, the EU's decarbonised gases package, which is obviously coming back into trilogues over the next couple of weeks, one of the big contentious questions has been this unbundling of transmission versus production. How concerned are you, Jakob, about the idea that fossil fuel companies that got us into this mess are going to potentially have big monopolies on getting us out? What's Parliament's priorities when it comes to kind of checking the role of industry in the hydrogen economy?
Well, in that regard, the biggest thing for us is to make sure that we only create demand for actually green hydrogen, so that we don't create an ecosystem where we produce hydrogen with fossil gas, for example, and we expand that kind of infrastructure, which I think is a dead end. But I wanted to comment on another thing, which is what we could do with regards to IRA, since because of our limitations in our fiscal capacity and flexibility, we cannot do some of the things that the US can do with its IRA, but we have something that they don't have. We have carbon pricing. And that can play actually a very similar effect. I remember very clearly in the previous mandate when I was negotiating ETS, and a certain Swedish steel company sent lobbyists telling me that we shouldn't have carbon pricing because that will kill European steel production. And I asked them, well, isn't there a possibility of producing steel with hydrogen? Can't you try that? And they said, well, with the current ETS price around €5 per ton, that's not feasible. We need a much higher carbon price for that to be feasible. Okay. And then we succeeded. We radically transformed the way that ETS functions, and the price skyrocketed up at around 80, 90 euros per ton. And then that very same steel company could take the leap. And now that steel based on hydrogen is now profitable. Yeah. And if we would do more of carbon pricing and create investment certainty for the industry, when they themselves can make the calculations, if the carbon price is 120 euros, 150, 200 euros, then hydrogen will be economically beneficial in my sector. I think that's a much better route, and letting the market take those decisions based on certainty in carbon price, rather than politicians like me making decisions on we should create this infrastructure here, we should do this there. Let the market decide instead.
I want to come back to that in just a second, because it feels a little bit like we're doing everything we can to kind of nurse the market in this direction rather than allow, it's just simply not profitable at the moment. If it was, we wouldn't need the hydrogen bank. But I want to come back to that in just a moment. First, I wanted to ask, and this is something Marta's touched on already, but a question from Sanaz Najati, who says, given we've been through this problem with electric vehicles, with batteries, where what's proposed as a green solution comes with a whole host of environmental concerns. Jorgo, what are the concerns that we should have about hydrogen? What's the kind of double-edged sword that comes with this technology?
Water is not a concern, because IRENA, which is not suspicious, IRENA is the Renewable Energy Agency worldwide, has done the maths, and we need 0.08, so 0.1% of all fresh water to achieve the 2050 targets. And most of the hydrogen that you also mentioned in the global south will be produced very close to coastal areas where you have water, and Martin, you mentioned the desalination, which adds 1 cent, 2 cents per kilo. So water is an issue that will be fine. But I think there's one issue we should have a look upon, that's indeed neocolonialism. We don't want neocolonialism. any hydrogen coming from Namibia imported to Europe needs to be preceded by hydrogen produced for South African market or electricity for the South African market. So we want Namibia and South Africa first to get this and only after Europeans. No neocolonialism, to set this very clear. That's an important fact on sustainability.
But there are economic opportunities for developing countries as well in being involved in this trade.
It gives them enormous possibilities to emancipate, but local, regional communities first. And we really need, as Europeans, to have an eye on it. And I mean that seriously. Namibians understand. Egyptians are a little bit more relaxed. They say, no, we want to export. Slow down. You have ammonia production in Egypt. Use it for the ammonia production. Export ammonia, but create jobs there. And I say this clearly, having in mind what Mrs. von der Leyen yesterday did in Lampedusa. We need also to have in mind to create jobs in Africa. When it comes to other points of sustainability, there are so many facets of hydrogen. We are talking here in Brussels mainly about the green hydrogen. And you did well to discuss the additionality, maybe a little bit too unflexible, but we did well, we set global standards, and we can be proud of it. But that's green hydrogen. What about the rest? What about white hydrogen? What about nuclear hydrogen? So we need to have clear standards everywhere, and I'm sure that member states who are dealing with that, like Germany, a country I know very well, Vice Chancellor, Energy Minister is a green and very pragmatic green. He has discovered that we need a pragmatic approach, keeping a fair eye on sustainability. But in the transition period, we have to understand that unless we create these markets, we cannot achieve the climate goals to be durably sustainable. So it's good to have big ideas on sustainability now, so you kill sometimes a business. That's why he is more pragmatic. I'm saying that, quoting also what the Greens in Germany started now to endeavor something that Bellona likes, CCU. Carbon capture, CCS, carbon capture sequestration. It's in the green program now of the Germans and European for the European Parliament. So you see, what is sustainable changes if you have a deeper look into it and not just cover the surface. This is why this debate will take us hours, so I keep it there. Yeah. I keep it there. We need to be sustainable, but not ideological.
And Ruud, I'd like to come in. Are you sustainable or are you ideological?
Me, myself, I hope I'm sustainable for the next 40 years. One thing which I just want to mention here, and I think it's so important, but nobody talks about it, is standards. So we have a team which is almost under the radar. They're not here on the stage, etc., but they're really working on hydrogen standards. And the industry in Europe that has been working with hydrogen standards has quite a lot of them, also on safety aspects, on the kind of the upstream part. But of course, now that we start using hydrogen in the transport sector with people who've never worked with hydrogen before, in industries that never worked with hydrogen before, we need to also perpetuate those hydrogen standards into the end-use sectors, and again, play there a role very importantly internationally. The other element, of course, which I think is very important, is this whole idea about circularity and eco-design. Again, I think we are doing a very good job here. That needs to be one of those principles that is being rolled out. And now, I don't think that's an ideological principle. It's just very simple thinking about, okay, if we start scaling up electrolyzers production and consumption today, we're at a stage at some point in time where there's going to be a whole bunch of those electrolyzers that need to be recycled, just like we have to do with the renewables and other clean tech technologies. Have that already in mind when we're starting to roll out those technologies today.
Yeah. And I just wanted to come back to the point about market creation, because obviously this has been your day job for a while, is creating this hydrogen market. And what we're seeing from the Commission, especially with hydrogen, also with the natural gas purchasing platform, also we're told with critical raw materials, with other high-cost resources, that pooling demand and creating incentives is the right way to go. Have we given up on the free market as a way to shape our response to climate change? Do we really have to erect, huge multi-billion euro programs in order to win that hydrogen race?
I would say no. I just heard also on the panel that kind of, we policymakers should not make any choices. But here, I think, again, the hydrogen framework that we've put in place exactly exemplifies that we haven't really made a choice. But hydrogen, renewable hydrogen, can be used in any sector. So it can be used in any sector. It contributes to those renewable energy targets that we've put forward. But what we have done is to try to identify some priorities in terms of those end-use sectors. Why? Because what we see there is that, for example, those big industries and the big people who buy the ships and the airplanes, etc., they have to purchase them today, and they're going to be there for 30, 40 years. So what we try to do is to enable those long-term investment decisions to be made. And that's why we're helping out with those priorities. It's not that you kind of choose that something is or is not allowed. So that, I think, is an important one.
Yeah.
Now, the second one of creating the supply and demand, I think already the industry in itself is doing a tremendous job through kind of, the transmissions operators are doing calls for interest. We had the European Clean Hydrogen Alliance, which put a pipeline together already in 2021, I think it was. So the industry itself is already doing a tremendous job in bringing the producers and the consumers together. What we're trying to do is to enable this, bring it to a European platform. Don't avoid that information is being kept somewhere at an outskirt in a member state, but bring that at a European level so that it can be used by the market players to do their business.
Yeah, I'd like to come to a question from Antoine Hoxha, who says that there's a fundamental difference between carbon pricing on one hand and the Inflation Reduction Act on the other side. One's a stick, one's a carrot, and the EU should be supporting its industry, not squeezing it. Is that a concern for you, Jakob? Is that something that you've tried to reflect in your appraisal of the Commission's plans?
I mean, if I was given the choice of whether to get a carrot or getting beaten by a stick, of course I would ask to have the carrot and not be beaten by a stick. The thing is, carrots aren't free. You have to pay for them. If it's a subsidy or if it's a tax credit, the money has to come from somewhere. And we have an aging population in Europe. We have a large investments needed to be done in education and in healthcare. We have climate disasters. We need to spend more money on adaptation. It's not like we have an abundance of tax money that we can just spend. Actually, we have to make sure that we're also using the stick and saying that if you're buying coal, if you're buying gas, you're going to have to pay for it. And then use that as an investment certainty for the industry, that their investments in alternatives to coal, oil, and gas will be profitable in 5 or 10 years. To me, that's a much better route than wasting tax money.
Marto, I mean, what do you think? Do you think that the industry is getting enough support, or do you think actually it's time to start ending some of the practices that we've been engaged in for years that have got us into this situation? Is it time to be tougher on business and force people to transition to hydrogen or other clean fuels, carbon capture?
I think Europe is moving in the right direction. I think the reforms on the ETS, giving a clear price to pollution, so making the polluter pay for their emissions, is actually moving us in the right direction. And also, we redirect most of that money coming from the ETS into clean investment. If the hydrogen bank exists at all, it's thanks to the ETS. We shouldn't forget this, ETS money goes into the innovation fund money goes into the hydrogen bank. So thank you, ETS, for making the hydrogen bank possible. This is something we often forget. But no, I do think that the European direction is good. I think also with CBAM coming in and finally, getting rid of those free allowances that I personally think have no reason to exist anymore, we are moving towards a market that actually internalize the prices that as a society we pay for these emissions. Because we need to pay when a climate disaster happens to, clean up after the mess that we created. So if we internalize this cost and we avoid having to pay down the road and having to pay much more, academia is clear on this, the IPCC is clear on this, climate disasters will cost us way more than investing today into clean technology and avoid climate disasters. So I think this is the right way, and Europe should go on with this strategy.
Jorgo, I'd like you to come in on that. I mean, as someone who represents business, obviously, are we punishing people too much? Is there too much stick and not enough carrot, or are the carrot troughs overflowing?
I mean, we are hopefully at the end of the Anthropocene. No? So we are seeing what we did, which impact we humans had in this time. It's a negative one, and we need to end it. So we need to change basically the gear, or to change the course of where we are going. And basically, you need money for that. It's not possible without money. I think Jakob is totally right. There needs to be incentives, and we incentivize industry in Europe, in the system. But at the same time, who is refurbishing the pipelines? Who is making the ports hydrogen ready? The buffers? All this infrastructure needs investments. Some of that and major part will come from the industry, but it needs to be risked. And that's the job, and I totally agree, that's the job that the public, the taxpayer has to do right now, because de-risking is also de-risking climate problems, de-risking this business. And this is why it goes hand in hand. Mrs. von der Leyen said when she 1 year ago announced the Hydrogen Bank, there will be 3 billion. I said 3 billion per year, and Ruud was just asking me, where do you find that money? I think if we put together what the Commission and the member states are doing, because the member states can contribute much more. There are these national plans, these national environmental climate plans, and there are countries that are super committed. I talked about Cyprus, looks into it. Other countries like Italy have shifted their priorities. Huh? They looked into hydrogen, and now they shift. No good. So we need to find a way, also parliamentarians, to get all the European family on the table, going to invest into this. And in the end, for us, it's not important whether the money comes from Rome or from Brussels. It needs to be a European investment, and in the end, we will achieve the 3 billion per year, I'm quite sure. Other than that, we cannot cope with it. EIB needs to be ready to go for infrastructure. All these things. I'm very confident, and I totally agree with your point. It is an investment into the future of our children.
Yeah, and Jakob, how convinced are you we're getting that investment right, and that the next generation are going to have a planet that functions on clean energy and isn't on fire or flooded?
Well, I think to connect with the introductory speech, it's important for us to realize that if we win this race, but only we transform, and the Americans, the Indians, the Chinese don't, are we really winners then? No, we're all losers, because everybody needs to make that transition. And I think it's important that we don't look at this only through that very narrow Europe first lens. Yes, Europe has the responsibility to lead. We have technology, we have carbon pricing, we have educated citizenry. Of course, we can and we should lead, but we shouldn't be doing this in a way that doesn't enable other parts of the world to also be part of this green revolution.
And then, Ruud, if this race is against climate change rather than against China or against the US. What's next? What's the next hurdle we have to jump over? What can we expect from the Commission in order to make what I think everyone agrees is a really promising clean energy technology a reality in Europe?
Yeah. So I think that indeed our job is not done yet. We are still working on those pieces of legislation, and it's really encouraging also to see that the member states and the parliament are really behind kind of closing all of these files by the end of the year, because they know how important it is. But indeed, the next stage is that you have those rules and regulations, but really one of the key elements is this implementation. And it's very interesting to see already, and I think member states are keen, for example, to give a very specific example, those targets that we have for the uptake of hydrogen in industry and transport. How are we going to translate that into really kind of action on the ground? And I think there's a tremendous job which we can already start before the end of the year to make that happen. And the other thing, I think it's important really to kind of bring along other countries. I think COP28 is going to be an important element for that. The European Commission is already making itself kind of very strong in terms of setting these global targets for renewables and energy efficiency. And we'll do the same for hydrogen as well. We really want to make sure that kind of those rules and standards kind of are taken up globally such that we can help this energy transition to happen everywhere. And I was very encouraged to see that. I think everyone here sees that as an important role for the EU.
And you're confident that the Commission's current plans will see the EU become and remain a global leader in hydrogen?
What I find very encouraging is to see hydrogen offtake agreements happening within the EU. So you can have numbers on figures and potential tax credits that are being happening in the future, etc., or projects, multi-scale projects, individual projects. But actually having hydrogen offtake agreements across sectors happening here in the EU, that boosts me with confidence. That means there are producers that are willing to make the investments into production. That means there are off-takers there which have never done hydrogen before, which are actually into the market to start buying that hydrogen. Having that means we have something, we've done something right to create this emerging ecosystem.
Well, it seems like it's a position shared by those of you in the room and watching online. We've had a fascinating discussion. I think we've probably all agreed that the initial headline, my initial headline, was a little bit too pessimistic. Europe might not be losing the race against China, against Russia, and hopefully it's not losing the race against climate change either. From the results of the poll presented by CEPSA, you will see that 59% of you believe that the EU has set ambitious renewable energy targets and just needs to get that investment package right in order to deliver on the promise of hydrogen as a clean fuel. Just under 1 in 3 think the EU is simply playing catch-up and is at risk of creating dependence on imported hydrogen. I wonder if we ran the results again after following the discussion, whether that would still be the same. And 1 in 10 people delighted, say the EU's done everything right. And the response to the IRA has been clear and comprehensive. The EU's competing globally. So there we go. Fairly split room, but a positive outlook. I'd like to thank all of our speakers for joining us today, as well as you, the audience, those of you who asked questions, who've tuned in online. It's been fantastic. And I'd obviously like to thank, once again, our partner, CEPSA, for making this event possible. We'd love to hear your feedback, so please do feel free to email us about the event at live@politico.eu. And as always, you can check our website for the latest Politico event lineup. We've got a whole battery of events happening this year, including our Sustainable Future Week, which is taking place from November the 14th to November the 16th in Brussels. Look forward to seeing you all there. Thanks, guys. And I think it falls to me to tell you that there's some refreshments out in the lobby, lest I stand between you and refreshment.
This is an age of disruption, of profound revolutionary change.
What we're really asking ministers is to empower the ambassadors.
The only thing that you really push forth is the truth.
You don't see many women represented when it comes to the decisions as to how to handle the pandemic.